as Latinos, we cannot take our foot off the gas pedal right now because we have to succeed. So balance is what comes between hustling, but understanding that you also need to have your own life.
Welcome to the Chingona Revolution podcast, where we will bring out your inner badass Latina, overcome self-doubt, help you gain clarity, and pave your own path, all while leading with courage. I am your host, Latina coach and speaker, Erica Cruz. If you have ever tied your worth to your productivity, or if you've ever thought that if you slow down, then you won't get ahead or things will fall apart, or maybe you feel like you should just be happy because you are so much further than maybe your parents ever got, but you still feel like something is missing, then today's episode is for you. I want you to know that you are not alone. I have felt this. My guest today has felt this, so much so that she wrote a book on it. So we're going to talk about the identity crisis that occurs whenever we tie our worthiness to our work, whenever there is the pressure to hustle, even when you're tired and exhausted, and how you can connect with a softer, more grounded version of yourself without losing your ambition, which I think is so key. In this episode, I am joined by Anne-Marie Dunning, who is the co-author of Radical Señora Era. And we're diving into what it really does mean to be ambitious and at peace at the same time. We talk about why so many of us don't know who we are outside of our careers, how hustle culture is actually rooted in survival and why it's so hard to let go of, even when we're no longer in survival. And we redefine success. We talk about the hidden trauma behind needing to do more all the time and how to redefine success using both your ambition, but also your ancestral wisdom. So if you're ready to step into your more peaceful Señora era, this podcast episode is for you. Let's get into it. Welcome to Chingona Revolution podcast. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored.
I'm excited for this conversation. I feel like we have so much that we can touch on and talk about between the book, between entrepreneurship, between being Latina in this country. So many different ways we can go with this. But for the people who may not know who you are, would you mind just giving us a quick intro?
Sure. So my name is Anne. I'm a Chilean-American writer. My book right now is called Radical Señora Era, Latin American Secrets for a Healthier, Happier Life, which I co-wrote with my bestie, Christina Kelman, who's a third-generation Mexican-American. And the book is a guide to basically reclaiming rest, joy, and wellness by looking to the daily routines and traditions of, our abuelas, our bisabuelas, our tatarabuelas, essentially the señoras of the past. But with an eye towards, and being ambitious, but with an eye towards balance.
Ooh, I love that. Yes. So before we get into the book, I want to ask, why did you write the book? And then we'll start there, because then I have questions about how you managed it with a bestie.
Yeah. Yes. So yes, it's a story that started it did for I think many people, many brands. It started during the pandemic. So during the pandemic, I was living in San Francisco. I was a startup marketer. My friend Christina was in the finance space also in San Francisco. I was a first-time older mom. The world shut down, and like many people at the time, I felt like I didn't sort of like have any client work. Like wasn't sure what. Like I almost like when I was left without having to do like this sort of hustle, I kind of started feeling a little lost and sort of started to realize that like our identities were sort of like, why was my identity so tied to my work that I felt like I was like worth like what was my identity if I didn't have this like startup job where I was like busy 24/7 and like I had a baby and like, oh my God, I can't do anything else. I had figured I could work with the baby, but then COVID came, right? So everything just kind of went haywire. During this pause from work is when we started a beauty brand called Vamigas, and like give it to two type A Latinas who are like lost to think, okay, let's just start a beauty brand, right? Let's just start a beauty brand. So that's where Vamigas was born. And essentially with this brand, because of the brand, we started documenting our señora lives on TikTok. We opened up a TikTok. It was like a sad little TikTok with 200 followers. And kind of in a funny way, we went viral. But funny enough, our products, like we didn't go viral with our product videos. We went viral with our Senora content. So basically we were like documenting like my garden and like, just home life. And Christina's big on like design and like home design and furniture and sales. And so people really wanted to talk about being in their Senora eras too, and being in their gardens and slowing down. And so we started getting like millions. We got like millions of views on multiple videos. We quickly climbed to like 60,000 followers on TikTok and like 20,000 on Instagram. We're like, we got something here. Like we've got these, millions of views, and this still sort of little community started. So we essentially then went all into our Senora eras, and we started creating content around that. And we started talking to the community and writing the newsletter came from that too. Our blog came from that, just sort of talking about what our community wanted us to talk about. And that turned into a book. We sort of pitched it as like more of like a recipe book to to a publisher, and they were like, we love the idea, but we want more of your story, and we want more of the background, and what is Senora Era? What is a Radical Señora Era? And that turned into a book. That's where that idea came from.
That is wonderful. So before we get further into how creative I think the book is because there's still recipes in there, and there's still beauty tips in there, and there's still all of this amazing stuff in there. When you talked about you couldn't work and then your identity was wrapped up in there, I think something that's happening so much present day is there's a bunch of tech layoffs. There are so many shifts and changes. And I don't think we realize culturally how connected we are from an identity perspective to our job. So what would you say to the person that is going through that right now? Maybe they were just laid off and now they're having this identity crisis of who am I if I'm not my job title that I worked so hard to get?
Yeah, that's a really hard one because yes, and I have many friends who sort of are going through that transition. I think that what I would tell them is you are so much more than your output and what you produce at work and what your day-to-day job is. And if that were to all end right now, what would that mean for you? Who would you be? And that is the true person that you are right now. And even if you continue to have this amazing job and you don't get laid off and you end up being the CEO of your company, you should still sort of retain this idea of who you are outside of work, what you love outside of, creating reports, right? Or like getting media press or doing the marketing analytics, right? You have to truly figure out who you are outside of that, what you love to do, what helps you slow down, what helps you feel good. Because honestly, if you don't sort of get laid off now, what's going to happen is you're going to get older and you're going to end up retiring. And you're not going to know what the heck you're doing, who the heck you are. And you're just going to have the worst retirement and the worst sort of aging era ever. So I think it's not only it's good for you it's good for you to separate yourself from your job now, because of your own mental health now, but also in the future when your life is going to change after you retire.
That is such a good point. So even if you were working a job that may not be replaced by AI or may not be directly affected, at some point you will need to retire. You can't work the rest of your life. So why not learn those skills now? Exactly. Rather than later in life when it's inevitable you'll have to at some point. So what does it mean for us to really embrace our Señora era?
So it really it's very similar to when people talk about slowing their slow living era, or some women sometimes talk about their on social media, their soft life. We're a little bit different than that sort of that concept, but it's about personal balance. It's about knowing that sometimes you can just having these strategies that you can engage with, that you can create for when maybe times are tough, or when maybe you're feeling stressed, or when you're overwhelmed. These sort of strategies that are as simple as what our abuelas and bisabuelas did and tatarabuelas did, which is you go sit outside and have some tecito, some cafecito, and help and have things like that make you feel good without having to, I don't know, spend like $500 for a gym membership, right? Or like something that doesn't require money, something that doesn't require effort, something that is just there in your house and that you can easily go back to. And when during times when you're challenged, or when there's obstacles, or when you're particularly stressed. So it really is about like balance, understanding who you're outside of work, and having these strategies, these simple strategies that you're borrowing from Latin American women of the past to slow down, to soothe yourself, and just to feel good. Simple ways to feel good.
So what I find so fascinating is that looking at our abuelas and how they were able to slow down, but somewhere along the line, that same culture has taught us that we need to work hard, be humble, try to get the best job possible. So it's very fascinating to me how we're like reclaiming culture, but yet because you were born in Chile, right? And then you immigrated. So what's happening once we get to the United States that's making us lose connection with this that's already ingrained in our culture? And it's almost like this ancestral wisdom that's there, but we somehow lose it once we're in a different country striving for a better life. And then that's kind of lost.
Exactly. And I couldn't have put it better myself. So essentially what happens is when we come here, you may be an immigrant. I was in elementary school when I came here with my parents, but if you're an immigrant or your parents were immigrants, you come here and in general, you're going to struggle. Your parents are going to struggle. They may have a hard time getting jobs. My parents were young. They had just graduated from college, but college degrees don't transfer when you come here, or at least they didn't in the 80s. And so essentially like, your parents have to come here and hustle as hard as they can to literally put food on the table, right? So you sort of like get this, and I've actually talked to Latina therapists about this too for the book. So you sort of get this, you end up connecting life with working hard and working 24/7 because that's what our parents had to do to take care of us. And so when you grow up, it's really like this sort of hustle culture, this idea of like, go, 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 always working, never resting. You're lazy if you're resting. That follows us for the rest of our lives. And many of us go on to college, we go on to get the graduate degrees. Some go on to be lawyers and doctors and marketing and finance. And we don't lose that. And like, we're sort of no longer like in our struggle eras, like we were when we were growing up, but we still have the mentality as though we were. So I feel, and many therapists have told me this too, who I've talked to for my work, is that we retain this sort of idea of like, oh my God, we're still struggling. If I stop right now, if I stop working right now, if I take a break, if I feel relaxed, I'm going to lose everything that I've worked hard for. I need to continue working. And I think that is part of it. And that is why we've lost a lot of the sort of like slow, gentle, like calm, ancestral, like traditions and routines that our family had back home, right before we left, or many generations maybe have had. And it's also Latin American culture is also very different than American culture in that it's like here, there's always been this idea since the 60s, since like the era of Mad Men, of workaholism. Like there's this problem that some folks are workaholics. We don't really have that problem, or at least we didn't in Latin America. So it's like a very sort of, also, I guess that's part two, a very different sort of cultural idea around work. Here, work is your life and your identity. In Latin America and in most other places of the world, work is just something you do to just, to rent, to buy your house, right? It's just something that you do, and then you stop at the end of the day. So I think those are the two reasons why we sort of end up end up stuck in like this sort of idea that we're still struggling, and like, oh my gosh, how dare we rest? Like, how dare we like relax and feel like not be productive?
Yes. Oh, you're so right. And, especially culturally, when you're in Europe or when you're in Latin America, it's not uncommon for stores to be closed on Sunday. It's not uncommon for them to be closed from 2 to 4 so they could go have lunch or take a nap, right? If you're Spain, to do their siesta. And it's so ingrained in the culture, but yet in the States, it's like, oh, what stores open the longest, right? And which one can produce the most? And yeah, the values there. I love your explanation there, how we're no longer in the survival, but we're still acting like we're in it. And yeah, this shows up, especially as you mentioned earlier, you and your bestie, type A Latinas. I can relate, also a fellow entrepreneur here. And I think even whenever we leave the rat race of, working in corporate and then you work for yourself, you kind of create your own little rat race. And that's when you burn out. And that's when you realize, wait, I really do need to embody what's in this book. And what I love about the way this book is written, it's a self-help book, but it's very practical, where you share both of your stories. You also share tips for wellness, tips for beauty, and also just productivity. I don't want to use a productivity. I forgot exactly what you called them. Boss lessons. That's what it is. And one of the lessons that I bookmarked, because I wanted to ask you about, because I think it's so ingrained in our culture and sometimes can be used against us. And that is the Radical Señora boss lesson number 13. Nothing is a life or death emergency, but yet for some reason, when you're an entrepreneur, or even when you're working for something else, for somebody else, if something's not going your way, it feels like an emergency, right? It feels like if we don't fix it right now, everything's going to fall apart. So can you tell us more about that? Because I was like, I have to ask about this one.
Yeah, so I particularly had a hard time with that because, so my in my day job, I do public relations and media relations for startups, for women, for Black women and Latinx led startups, particularly tech startups. So, it's like sometimes I have to take calls from media, and it's like sometimes it gets chaotic, and I have to do things like last minute, and I have deadlines. So sometimes I forget that sort of like if I don't answer an email on, like, let's say a Friday, I feel like, the world's going to end, right? And I'm going to lose my client, and oh my God, I'm not going to have any money, and I'm going to have to go back to Chile, right? But what I learned from Christina, and she sort of picked this strategy up long before I did in finance, is that essentially what she told me is, corporates want you to have this sort of fake idea of deadlines because it's good for their bottom lines, but it has nothing to do with you. So it's not urgent for you. It's essentially just urgent for the corporates, or the boss of the boss, or the corporation that owns your CEO's company. It's just good for their bottom line to have you do something as soon as possible. And so she says, it can always wait till Monday. 2 days is not going to make a difference. No one's going to fire you. You're not going to lose that client. It really is never as sort of like urgent as the corporates want you to think. So it's really always just about the bottom line. And you have to always kind of keep that in mind. Like, whose deadline is this really?
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the things I learned from her that was really interesting.
Yeah, it really puts things into perspective. So you mentioned Christina's your bestie, and you started a beauty line together, and you also wrote a book together. So how did you manage? Do you find that your personalities just complement one another, or how would you suggest? There's probably friends who listen to this podcast, right? And maybe they've had ideas. So how did you go from idea to execution and then work together on that?
Yes. So I think what's key is, like, what is key in building a company. It could be anything. It could be a podcast. It could be a startup. It could be a beauty brand, a clothing brand, a small business, is to have a business partner that doesn't have the same skills and the same sort of personality type that you do. Sometimes that may be by accident. You may your friend may have the skills that you don't have, and that is always going to work out better than if you sort of both had the same weaknesses and the same strengths. So in my case, I'm very much like a kind of like a bigger picture person. I don't implement well. I just think about, and I just kind of want to do, but I don't know how to do it. Christina, on the other hand, is very detail oriented. She's very operations focused. I think that is why I think Vamigas took off so quickly, and it only took us like a few months to launch at Nordstrom and then like Target and stuff, is because our skill set were so complementary. And also she had a different background, different, stronger experience, stronger sort of like background in the beauty business than I did. So I had the marketing background. She had the sort of like finances and beauty industry experience. So it would have been so much harder had I done it by myself, or if me and her were both like marketers, or if we didn't have any beauty experience. So always try as best as you can to find someone with complementary skills and a complementary industry background. It's always going to work better.
That makes so much sense. So as people are listening, right, and you're mentioning big retailers that are competitive to get into, and it's difficult. So I think a question that can come up for people is, how in the world do you embody your Señora era when you have to be in your hustle mode era?
Yes.
And I think Señora era doesn't mean sit around and don't do anything and don't be productive.
Yes.
So tell us what the difference is. Like, how do you embody your Señora era, but still live your life, right? And still do the things that bring you fulfillment.
Yes. And I think the question is particularly important right now, because we, as Latinos, we cannot take our foot off the gas pedal right now, because we have to succeed. We have to keep going, because right now the world is against us. It's throwing us a lot of challenges and obstacles. It's throwing our community a lot of obstacles and challenges. So I think the biggest concept is balance. So balance is what comes between hustling for the sake of hustling and doing a job that you really love, but understanding that you also need to have your own life, and you also need to have your own strategies for taking yourself out of that life, like out of that sort of like career mindset whenever you can. So it's all about being, so it really is all about being like ambitious. You can be as ambitious as you can. You can climb up the ladder. You can, go into as many retailers as you can, but you always have to have in your mind the idea of balance. And who am I outside of this goal? Who am I outside of this success? Who am I outside of this press stuff that I'm getting? Who am I as a person? Who am I authentically? And what helps me slow down? What helps me feel happy outside of like, oh, great, we got into Target. That makes me so happy. That is my happiness in life. That should not be your happiness in life. You should have another type of happiness in life where you're like, I love going for walks. I love walking my dog. I love making this latte. That sort of aspect is very, very important. And I think that all goes that like, all that to say that balance is the most important thing that you need if you want to, if you're very ambitious, but you also want to honor and embody this idea of being in your Señora era.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And with Target, right, you never know when they're going to suddenly cut 50% of products from that shelf that you're on, right? Like it can be taken away like that. So if your worthiness is tied into that, your worthiness is going to shatter.
Yeah,
so
totally.
Yeah. And right now I know you talked about how your TikTok really took off, not even just with the beauty brand with Vamigas, but through this Señora Era concept. And I think a big thing that we're seeing on social media right now is also these parties that are happening, and they're happening at coffee shops and during the day. And I think that's very aligned with people are prioritizing their wellness in a different way. And the younger generation is like, nope, don't want to burn out. Don't want to, right? Like I want to get my 8 hours of sleep. I want to go to a coffee shop instead of get hammered in the evening.
Yeah. Yes,
so
exactly.
It's definitely something that's taken over the internet. But it's not just for Latinas and for women, right? So like who can embody this Señora era?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, really, being a señora, anyone can be a señora and a radical señora. It could be for men, for women, for, LGBTQ folks, for older folks, for younger folks, Gen Z to, Gen Boomer, right? And it's just a mindset. It's like there's there's always this misconception that being a señora is, just like, you're an older woman and you have to be married and you have to have kids and you have to just sweep the floors of your kitchen, right? It's a lot more than that. And it's really just a concept of like balance and knowing how to slow down and knowing how to separate your work life from your personal life. So because of that, because of it, that it's a mindset, anyone can be a señora. Anybody can enter their señora eras or their señor eras.
Love it. Yeah, I love it. And you mentioned earlier that you talked to a lot of Latina therapists. Actually, before recording this, getting on this podcast recording, I was in my therapy session, and my therapist doesn't usually ask me this, but she was like, "Oh, what do you have after?" I was like, "Oh, and I was telling her about the book, and I was like, it's perfect timing. Her and I were just talking about the importance of, I just finished an enrollment for my business. And I was telling her how, things are going well and it's asking a lot of me. And I'm grateful for it. But at the same time, I'm prioritizing my sleep at the same time. I'm ensuring I still go to my workouts and I get to what I can get to. And like you were saying, not everything's an emergency. And I'm like, I can respond to that email tomorrow. And if that client is really interested, tomorrow's going to be okay. So it was like divine timing that, I happened to be talking to you right after. But I'm curious, as you spoke to multiple therapists, what were some of the trends that you heard or things that were really surprising to you from talking to Latina therapists, either about our culture or about the first generation or the immigrant generation here in the States?
That's a great question that nobody's asked, but it's very interesting because I think one of the most surprising things that I heard from multiple therapists, and actually, so one in particular that I'm thinking about, Dr. Mariel Bouquet, who wrote our foreword, is that the thing that we talked about earlier, which was like the fact that we're stuck in our we're still stuck in our struggle eras, even though many of us may not be in our struggle eras, is a trauma response. And I never thought about it like that. I had several conversations with them about how immigration, if you're a kid, immigration in particular is traumatic, no matter what, like no matter how you got here, it's always going to be traumatic because you left people you love in your homeland, thousands and thousands of miles away, and it's traumatic because it's almost like experiencing death as a child. So that was one of the very surprising things that I heard, and that makes sense, and that sort of helped me think, that made me think differently about how I grew up and some of the quirks that I have that maybe go back to the fact that I was an immigrant kid, so that was a very, very interesting idea that I heard from the therapists.
Yeah. And it makes so much sense, right? Because it was like a death of everything you knew, from hearing Spanish everywhere to suddenly a different language, to knowing what the street signs look like, to knowing that your friend was down the street and now who are your friends here? Are you ever going to fit in? Yeah. It makes sense that it would be such a traumatic experience.
Yeah.
What is your favorite part of the book? I'm sure you have many, but is there either a specific recipe or chapter that you guide people to whenever you recommend your book?
Yeah, so there's one sort of like philosophical concept that I love, and one very really practical one. So the practical one is the rose water recipe, agua de rosa. And essentially, like, the reason why we had that rose water recipe in there is because it's a staple in the señoras of the past. It goes back hundreds of years back in Latin America. It was their perfume. The rose water was the core of their beauty routine, of señora's beauty routine. From Latin America, pre-Columbian era. It's just like a sort of a very important concept, and it's fun because doing it now kind of can connect you to having this recipe, can connect you to what your great grandmother may have created on a random weekend. And so we thought that was really beautiful. And then secondly, I really love the history chapter. And that came sort of like as a surprise. We didn't expect for it to be a history chapter, but essentially we talked about señoras through history and what their lives were like, starting with indigenous people, the original people of this land, of South America and Central America, and what their lives were like, how they were like as kids, as young women, as curanderas, as midwives, and then going through the sort of going into like post conquistas, right? Like after they subjugated the indigenous people, and going through what the colonial women's lives were like, how strong they were, like how they all had businesses, and then just kind of going through like pre-war up until today. So that was a very, very unique thing for me to research, because I found out a lot of really interesting things that I didn't know about women of Latin America. And one of those is, I just mentioned that there's this sort of idea that Latin American women were just sort of like always very traditional. There's this whole idea of like Marianismo and machismo. And of course, that was very much part of that world. Mm-hmm. But they were very, very strong women. They had businesses. They had real estate. They managed their husbands' houses. They were like accountants. Indigenous women had these amazing small businesses where they sold products, and they made products. So Latin American women they've always been so powerful that I think they often get shortchanged as just like, oh, they're just these traditional ladies. We have nothing to learn from them, but we have a lot to learn from them. And I realized that as I was writing the book.
Ooh, I love that take. Yeah. And in chapter 1, it says, stepping into your great grandmother's era, just the good parts. Tell us what you mean by just the good parts. That caught my attention right away.
Yeah. Yes. So, there's this concept of marinismo, machismo, racismo, clasismo, right, in all of our countries, which made many of our great grandparents' lives, great grandmothers' lives very difficult, right? They had no rights, they couldn't vote. And so when we say we want to borrow their traditions and their routines, we want to borrow only the good parts, meaning the things that made them feel good, the things they made with their hands that can help us now, the things they cook that we can learn from now, but not being subjugated by your husband and not being unequal in your relationship, not having any rights, and just sort of having this sort of like meek role in your marriage, right? So I think that's what we meant by not just calling this a Señora Era book, but a Radical Señora Era book. That's where the sort of radical concept comes in.
Definitely. What about the woman who maybe wants more? She feels, I think this is a common thing. I have a group coaching program, so I've coached over 300, mostly Latina women. So this is something I see that happens over and over. Yeah. They are ambitious. They work really hard. They get good grades. They get the job. And then they get there and then they're like, wait, I'm not happy. This isn't exactly what I thought I wanted to do, right? It's such a common experience. And typically what they are lacking is purpose, connection, right? It's not that they don't want to work, right? It's not like they just want to be what they call now the Pilates princesses and just like stay at home. We're too driven for that, right? We actually want to do something. So if they are feeling like they want more income, more visibility, and they feel like in order to do that, they just have to hustle. Yeah. What would you say to that person? Because I feel like you and I have been that person at some point, so you can talk from experience, but what would you say to that person who wants to do more, but they feel like they need to just burn out or go hard or pull all-nighters in order to do this?
In many ways, we internalize this American idea of you're only successful if you succeed in certain ways, like in making money and being productive, right? But that's a lens that your culture doesn't have. And so sometimes what you have to do is just sort of like take the lens from your culture, which has a lot to do with family, community, good food, having a good time, feeling good, connecting with people, getting out of the house. And so it's really sort of like, just remember that that you can use two lenses to figure out what makes you successful. You don't have to use the American lens all of the time to feel successful and to reach your goals. You can also use your sort of Latin American ancestral lens, which in many ways gives you a different set of goals to be happy. I hope that makes sense.
Definitely. Okay. Yeah. Yes, definitely makes sense. And one of the patterns that I've seen in clients that have come to me, this is a repeated thing I've seen. Yeah. Some people may go off and start businesses, but other people might just do something creative, like creating content, or learn to make tortillas with like the flour tortillas, right, with their hands. And like that becomes so fun. And I feel like what we are missing sometimes is just connection. And what I love about the book is that it supports you in connecting to what our ancestors knew and we just lost somewhere along the way. Yeah. This is a beautiful cover of a very strong woman. So what's the story behind the cover?
Yeah. So what happened is our publisher sent us 3 book cover ideas and we loved all of them. But, at first we weren't sure about that particular one because she sort of seemed like, to Christina, she thought, she seemed a little angry, like a little aggressive or assertive. Is she angry? And I was like, no, I don't think she's angry. I think she's just like sexy. Like she's just like cool, right? And so we sort of had these different ideas of this woman. The other covers were very sort of like calm and, grounded in your garden. But what we really liked about that cover is that it really is a woman who is confident in herself and in her goals and knows what she's doing and knows what she doesn't like and has a strong sense of identity. I think that's why we like that cover. And we get a
I
lot of
agree.
people talk about the cover. They're like, "Oh my God, this is the most colorful, coolest cover that I've seen lately." So
Yeah, when I first looked at it, I immediately thought quiet confidence and
yeah,
just like
yes, exactly,
inherent worthiness rather than
exactly.
looking for it from others.
Yes, I love that.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, that's definitely what stood out to me. Is there anything, Anne, that I haven't asked you that you want to share with the listeners, or anything I should have asked?
Yeah, I'd love to share. So we no longer have Vamigas. We sort of let that go. Um, what we ended up doing is now we have a newsletter called Señora Era alongside our blog and our big social media community. We are a social media community of 100,000 amigas. We like to talk about any like home and garden topics and reading. We're going to be doing a book club. And that is a great sort of way for you to find a community if you want to find other señoras or señoritas. And you could find that at señoraera.com and sign up to that newsletter. We have a newsletter that goes out every Friday too, with just a bunch of like fun stuff on how to use traditions and routines of the señoras of the past, but also, maybe some cool deals on beauty. And maybe we might find like fun news about, favorite celebrities and home and garden stuff. So it's really like a cool newsletter that they can sign up for.
Wonderful. So we will have that linked down below. And if you
Perfect.
don't mind me asking, how did you come to the decision of closing Amigas?
Yes, that's a big story because what happened is so it is hard to have a beauty line. Um, but in many ways, there were obstacles that we didn't see coming. And one in particular was so being in retail was really difficult. We had a
Right.
funding partner. I was so glad to have Christina take over the sort of operations and finance section because she knew exactly what to do and how to fund it. But Target and Nordstrom's and things like that, it can get very, very expensive and you end up getting charged a lot more than you expect. And just things happen that you're not ready for. And we said, you know what, we made the sort of joint decision that it just being in retail completely, like being all of these retailers wasn't serving us. And it was just
Mm-hmm.
taking more money than it should have. And so we pulled out. But what really sort of made us leave the brand is there are, I guess, what I like to call ambulance chasers. When you have a small business that starts getting press, you've got people that target you with sort of like, almost like shakedown threats, right? You're going to have people targeting you and telling you like, oh, you send me $40,000 or I'm going to do a class action lawsuit over some teeny tiny like name. I don't know, like you have the same copyright as my copyright. And like people start going after you.
Oh,
And
geez, that's
there was
horrible.
just, the risk was just way too big. And we were like, let's get out because it's gotten worse too since COVID. Our lawyers like, yeah, it's like, that is like a very common thing for small business owners now to get targeted for shakedowns, and for like by ambulance chasers. So we're like, no, it's not worth it. We're just going to exit. So
Yeah, and that's horrible, right? Because
yeah,
as a small business owner, you
yeah,
are probably under-resourced and really doing
yes,
something because it's your passion and
exactly,
you really want to
exactly.
solve a problem for people.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's horrible. So, I ask because business isn't always up, and not everything is going to turn into like a blockbuster, and that's
yes,
okay. It's
yes,
not
yeah,
supposed
hmm,
to, right? It's
exactly,
really not supposed
exactly,
to, but I'm sure there's so
exactly.
much you learned through the
Yeah,
beauty brand, and it
yes,
directed you to writing a book, and the
exactly.
book probably wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the beauty
Totally.
brand.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. It led to other things that we would have never thought, and we couldn't be happier, So the universe will guide you, no matter what happens. That's how we sort of look at it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Anne, for coming on
Thank
and
you.
sharing your story and
Thank
talking
you.
to us about all the research you did for the book. Obviously, we will put the link down below for people to get their hands on the book. And then
Perfect.
any other links that you would like us to include down below, we'll do that in the show notes. Where can people follow you?
So if you're on TikTok, you can go to senora.era. And on Instagram, we are at official Senora Era. And also on Instagram, we're also at Radical Senora Book.
Wonderful. Great. Well, if you are listening to this podcast episode and you took anything away from this, or if you get your hands on the book, we want to see that. So take a photo and tag both myself as well as the Radical Señora book Instagram or TikTok, wherever it is that you post, because we definitely want to see. And then send us DMs if there's anything that really stood out to you from this interview. We also want to know what that was. And thank you so much. If you're in the Bay Area again, please let me know. I'd love to have coffee with you, or whenever I'm out in your area, I will let you know.
For sure.
And I'm sure we will speak again. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate everything.
Thank you so much for joining me this week. Make sure to visit theericacruz.com. That's Erica with a K, where you can subscribe to the show so you'll never miss an episode. You can help this podcast grow by supporting me with an Apple Podcast rate and review. If you took anything away from this episode, I invite you to take a screenshot and share it on social media so that your favorite badass Latinas can also check it out. Be sure to tag me at the Erica Cruz. That's Erica with a K, because you know I want to see it. If you're ready to join the revolution and be a part of the Courage Driven Latina community, visit couragedrivenlatina.com to get more information and join the waitlist. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week.